Welcome everyone. Today, this is the private well class, and today's webinar is on how to find local help and information. Um, we're located at this Illinois State Water Survey, one of the state scientific surveys in the state of Illinois, at the University of Illinois, and our private well class program is sponsored, funded, and supported by RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who I'll explain in a minute, and the funding comes from US EPA. Thanks for joining us, and we'll get started. If you are getting credit for today's webinar through NEHA, just understand that this same webinar has been delivered twice in the last year and a half or so, both in 2025. And your credentialing cycle is 2 years long. So if, for instance, your credentialing cycle just started on 6/1, 10 days ago, then you wouldn't be able to take this same webinar again until after 6/1/28. You should have already signed up if you're asking for CE credit when you registered for the webinar. Don't email us afterward asking for a certificate if you did, which should be most people. And if you don't receive your certificate in a week or two after, then that would be the time to email us. Okay, and these are the things we provide. We're also an LEHP provider for Illinois. We're based in Illinois. We work with our county health departments a lot. It makes sense for us to do that. We just don't have the bandwidth to try to expand that, if you will, and be a CE provider specifically for other states, at least not currently. So today, that's on local information. We actually created one of our 10 lessons. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But the private well class itself, which started this program in 2013, before we did any webinars, is a 10-lesson class that you sign up for, sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. And one of our lessons, lesson 7, is specifically about local information and getting local answers. That's really the secret to understanding more about your well and who the resources are near you, both people and sources of information. Working nationally like we do, many times what we end up doing is referring folks to someone locally who has the information they're looking for. So it's really important to understand what those sources are, and being a little bit inquisitive and finding out who in your local area, where are your well logs stored, who knows about water quality and testing, are there labs nearby, all those sorts of things. We do record every one of these webinars, and they're all available on our YouTube channel. If you just look under YouTube, it's the private well class, or just private well class. And so you can see all the questions that were asked. Like at the end of today's webinar, we'll go through some of the questions you all asked when you registered. For the last webinar that was done in November, they're different questions. And so it's always valuable to go back, not necessarily watch the entire webinar if you've already, like this one, but it's worth it to go to the back half of all those videos and see what questions were asked, and you can gain a lot of information there, as well as going through our help center, which I'll talk about in a little bit. At the end, if something comes up today and you have a question and we don't answer it, or it's something that's come up during the presentation that you have a question about, please enter that in the chat box or the question box that's in your GoToWebinar window. We will pull those up at the end and go through them. And so we're willing to stay and discuss those things as long as you are. So, yeah. I'm Steve Wilson, groundwater hydrologist here at the State Water Survey. I have with me Katie Buckley, who's our Water Resources Outreach Specialist. Katie organizes these webinars, manages the CEU program for this and our water operator program, and also is going to put your questions together in a document we can share at the end today. And Sally Dolan is also with us, Senior Scientific Specialist here at the Water Survey, and she provided answers to some of the questions today. So this is RCAP I mentioned earlier. We're a sub to them on their grant with the US EPA, and it's really we work together. So there's 6 regions. They're all shown up there in the states they cover. They have staff in every state. So in Illinois, for instance, where we are, I believe there's 5 staff, and 1 or 2 of those folks are working with well owners. Most of their staff are licensed water or wastewater operators. A lot of the work they do and funded through US EPA and USDA is to support small water and wastewater systems around the country that need to maintain compliance and be sustainable. And so they work in rural areas. And so this private well program, we're a direct partner with them. We basically helped establish some of the program that they deliver. What they offer, one, they can do well assessments, boots on the ground. I mean, go to a homeowner's residence, walk through a well assessment with them, identify if there's any vulnerabilities or risks or what they're doing right, give them recommendations, and it's even find their log possibly for them if it exists and it's available. In addition to that, which they've done, probably getting ahead of myself on my slides here, but in addition to the well assessments, they also put on workshops, provide service speakers. They can help organize workshops for professionals. So, for instance, if a county health department wanted to have, an event some evening, like during Groundwater Awareness Week in March, to help the well owners in their area, the RCAP folks would be willing to help organize that, advertise it, provide speakers or be speakers themselves about best practices, all those sorts of things. So they're the boots on the ground side, and we're kind of the online side, if you will, of this program that we would do together. And so, yeah, it's a really good partnership. We work with all 6 regions. We just held a national conference, and there were probably close to 20 RCAP staff who made it to that are all working with private well owners around the country. This is just one section of the well assessment I mentioned. This is section 10 on septic systems. We're actually creating a separate septic tool. It's actually being beta tested now. It'll have a lot more information, but this is just meant to be an example. There's a lot of things in this assessment. It gives you a lot of good information. It's a pretty powerful tool. So it's like a sanitary survey for those of you that may work with public water systems. They have to do a sanitary survey every 3 years. It's kind of a vulnerability assessment, but it's mandatory, where this is totally voluntary. It's not shared with anyone, but it's really an opportunity to educate well owners about their specific situation. If you've been to many homes with private wells, you find that rarely are 2 identical. Even if they're in the same aquifer, with the same type of casing, there's likely differences in treatment in the home, or the type of pipes in the home, or things they store near the well. I've been to thousands of wells, and really they're rarely, they may be similar, but rarely are they exactly the same. And it's an opportunity then for us as professionals to promote best practices, why they should sample every year for coliform nitrate, all those sorts of things. And it also helps encourage communication, and that's really important. A lot of well owners have misconceptions about what responsibilities and legal rights, say, a county health department or local health district have, and it's a way to help them understand that, yeah, as a county health department in Illinois, I can recommend that you do this or that because your well may be unsafe, but I can't condemn your well. I can't tell you you can't drink the water, some of those things. And so, because some well owners never go to their local health department because of that fear, when it's really misplaced. And as I mentioned, the site assessments that they've done, I didn't update this number. They've done over 4,000 of these assessments now all over the country, which is really cool, because it gives homeowners a lot of really great detailed information. And they also provide a water sample, which I forgot to mention, for most of this work. Not necessarily every assessment, for a lot of them. And so if you, we even have one state that doesn't have, it's a small state and it doesn't have a lot of staff. And when they have a real problem well, where there's some kind of contamination issue or something where they just don't have the staff to go out and help that homeowner, they call the RCAP regional person and they'll go out and work with the homeowner on their behalf. And so it's really a good program. It's all free. That's the big thing. It's all free of charge, thanks to the funding we get from US EPA. And again, they've done this number is old as well. A lot of workshops that they put on every year around the country. And this program has been in place since really the RCAP part of this has been in place since 2014. We started the private well class a year before that. But yeah, it's a good network that's been developed so that if you have questions, just like somebody today asked a question about Florida, the first thing that pops in my head are the two people I know there that I can call and who can help a homeowner in Florida, for instance. So what is the Water Survey? We're one of the state scientific surveys, like the State Geological Survey or Natural History Survey. Those two surveys exist in almost every state. Illinois is one of really, for a long time, it was the only state that had a water survey. Now there is one other. Oklahoma has a water survey. We were established in 1895 because of cholera and typhoid and the need to understand the water quality in the state, or even for our community water supplies. And we were formed by the state legislature, so we've been part of that since then. It's evolved into an organization that not only houses the state's well logs and answers questions from homeowners with wells and communities, but we provide data, we do applied research, we help solve problems for communities that have water issues, whether that's quantity or quality, as well as predicting water levels and water quality in aquifers through modeling and water supply planning activities. So we house the state hydrologists and the state climatologists. We have an atmospheric section. And so it's really a cool place to work because you get to do research without a PhD. I do anyway. And it's also a place where we help people every day who call us and have questions. And so we're on both sides of that. It really justifies a lot of things related to the data we collect and all that stuff because we're using it every day to support mostly the citizens of Illinois, but through this program nationally. This is just an example. We have a lot of files going all the way back to before 1900. This is a typhoid outbreak in Pana, Illinois in 1916, and it's just an interesting story just because half the town was sewer, the other half wasn't. They had a new water treatment plant that was built a few years before, but they weren't using it because the mayor said it was too expensive. And so there was all this speculation about what was causing this typhoid outbreak. And it turned out it was the Pana Ice Cream Company right in the middle of town that also sold milk. 7 different farmers brought milk to the ice cream company. They all went into one large tank that everyone used one bucket to scoop milk out to take back to their homes, and it got contaminated. And so it's interesting. The water survey went down and actually investigated this and actually found the solution and what was the cause and all that stuff. And there's, this is one example. There's hundreds of these records like this from different things related to water quality or public health in our files. Just another example, we also have about 1,500 glass plate or lantern slides, and this is a image I scanned from one of those 2x3 glass plates. A young man in New Athens, Illinois, down by St. Louis, is helping one of our scientists do some testing. So what we're here for today, though, is really to talk about private wells and how they're different from our public water supplies. So, they're not regulated. They are at construction in most states. So they have to meet a certain code for, the type of material that's used, some of those things. And in some states, they also have to be tested at installation to make sure they're bacteria free and for a few other things. And it depends on the state, coliform, nitrate, nitrite, maybe arsenic. But after they're built, then typically there's no requirements for any more testing unless it's through like a mortgage company during a property sale or those sorts of things. And so the thing to remember is a lot of people are like, well, my water looks, tastes, and smells just fine. Um, Things like arsenic, which is naturally occurring. We have two aquifers in Illinois that have fairly high arsenic. It's colorless, odorless, and has no taste. So you'd never know you're drinking it unless you test. And that is the message, is you need to test your water, not because it's likely contaminated, but you want to know for sure it is or isn't. And so I grew up on an old dug well. It was only 14 feet deep. It basically was always contaminated, but that's what I grew up on a small farm in central Illinois. Now I live in town and I'm part of a community water supply, and um, the $60 to $90 I pay a month, part of that's because I have a teenage daughter, but the rest that's the cost that's spread out over the 150, it should say homes, 150,000 homes in the area or so, for sampling, maintenance, infrastructure, all the things. So when I turn on my tap, I have clean, safe water and as much of it as I want to use. And if you're a well owner, that is all your responsibility. You need to maintain your well and your pump and all those things. You need to sample regularly to ensure that the water quality hasn't changed. And you need to make sure that, your piping and everything else is working properly. And, things happen. Wells eventually, there's a lot of sand and gravel wells around here. If the gravel pack or the grout weren't quite done properly in a well, you may start pumping sand, for instance. Well, that scours your pipes. Eventually, you may have a water leak or a pipe break. All those things can affect what your costs and everything else. So it's good to know what that all is. What we try to do through our class, especially, and by the time you take all 10 lessons, if you haven't signed up for that, you should. Really, it's about understanding your well. And the best way to do that is your well log, if there is one. And I know there's several questions today about finding a well log. You're not always going to find them. That's just the way it is. But you need to know how deep your well is, how much casing you have. A lot of folks in bedrock wells don't realize that most of the time the well casing only goes 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock and then it stops. And the rest of it is just an open hole that's been drilled. And that's specifically so that all the fractures in the rock can provide water to the well. If your pump's in the well, what's the pump depth setting? Or is it at the surface? Do you have a screen or not? You have a sand and gravel well, you have a well screen. If you're in a bedrock situation, you likely don't. So, and also even just knowing what might be in your water from your area. Like we know in Tazewell County, Illinois, well owners need to be concerned about arsenic. And I think I'll show some examples today, but there's other contaminants that are known to be in specific aquifers. Your state geological survey or a water survey, or maybe your Department of Environmental Quality, those groups, if you just Google my state, our groundwater quality, you'll find an organization that either has created maps of different constituents or has, even a website with a viewer that shows, it's mapping on the fly, all those sorts of things. It's about you understanding what kind of information is available to you, depending on the state you're in. Some have great information, some have very poor information. They just don't have the resources to do that. Also, going through our class in these webinars, hopefully you've learned enough about the basics of your well that whenever you do have a problem or you do have a question, you're asking better questions and you know who the contacts are locally to help you answer those. They're most likely the best folks to help you answer questions about your well or your geology or water quality. And then lastly, we preach this all the time, is to sample your well. You don't know if you don't test. It's just an important part of well maintenance. That's probably the most important part, is to sample regularly to ensure your well water is safe. So today we're going to talk about well logs, all the related information, aquifers, water levels, water quality, all that stuff. A little bit about financial help. There's not a lot of that available. And then, things about sampling your well. And so really it's about knowing where sources of these things are locally. And that's kind of the motivation and goal for today. The best way you can get help locally, as I mentioned this already, I guess, the folks in your area know your regs, know the local conditions, the geology. You know, if somebody calls me in Illinois and asks about the Muhammad Aquifer, which is the large sand and gravel aquifer that I spent a lot of my career working in, if you will, then I can give them, you know, pretty good information about, depending on where they're at in the state and as part of that aquifer. There are folks like that in every state. You just need to know who they are. And so it's a matter of finding out who your local sources are. You know, where are your well logs stored? Are they at the state level, the county or local health department level? You know, all those things. How active is extension? In some states, cooperative extension is really active, like in Virginia. Virginia Tech has a really active testing program. Texas has a Texas Well Owner Network. There's a number of others that have really active extension programs. Some states don't. And so it's understanding who those agencies are and those resources are at your universities that can help. And then, you know, you shouldn't be afraid to ask. Most of them are very willing and interested in supporting you and helping you find answers to the questions you have. So your driller is your best source of well information. And there's certainly times when that doesn't play true, but if you know who drilled your well and you want to get a copy of your log, if your state has an online database, you can look there. We do. But at the same time, your driller may have other information that's even more helpful if they're willing to do that. Now, we run into from time to time in states that maybe aren't as regulated where, yeah, I'll mention it later, but there's a state where a driller doesn't have to file a log, which is unfortunate. And so a homeowner may have trouble getting the log from a driller then, which should never be the case. But, you know, what we tell folks if they're going to drill a well is make sure it's in the contract that you get a copy of the log, because that's just ridiculous that they don't share those. And if not the driller, you don't know who the driller was, then is the agency that requires well logs to be filed. That's almost every state. And so some have, you know, a really great online database where you don't even have to talk to anybody. You can just go find it. Others, you'd have to call and see what they have. And like our online database is through our state geological survey, and it generates a log, but it's not the actual well log. And so sometimes then folks will call us to see if we have a scanned copy or if we can scan a copy, and we do that for folks in Illinois. And so the other issue, it's very variable, as I mentioned, and also the rules weren't always there, right? So like the well I grew up on was hand dug in 1933. It's not in our files. In Illinois, it was 1968, I believe, when we first passed the law requiring permits and well logs to be filed. And a few states don't have all of those requirements, or they have rules that require some logs to be filed. I mentioned Pennsylvania. You're not required to file a log if you're a driller in Pennsylvania. In fact, they don't really even have licensed well drillers, which I would be glad to explain if somebody has another question about that. At least Pennsylvania doesn't require it. And Mississippi, they have a rule, which is the only one in the state in the country I know of. A well has to be over 4 inches to file a permit or file a log with the state. And so you see a lot of 4-inch or less wells in Mississippi, as it turns out, because then the drillers don't have to share the information. And that's not the only reason. It's also, there's a fee. It saves $100 to somebody, or whatever it might be. But it's really, it comes down to, as a homeowner with a well, the more you know, the better. It helps you understand where your water's coming from. You know, if you have a screen that's at 200 feet, say 200 to or 195 to 200, you know the water's coming in your well there, versus a bedrock well that's 200 feet. If the well casing only goes down to 30 feet because bedrock's near the surface, then water can come in your well anywhere from 30 to 200 feet below land surface. that's a lot more concerning or risky that there may be a connection to the surface and any kind of superficial contaminants that might be able to get into a well. And yeah, so the best thing to do is just Google. Right? Start out there. If you Google California water well logs, you get all this information. It's funny because in California, 15 years ago, you could not get a well record unless you were the homeowner, and you had to go to your county health department to get it. And then they passed the right to water law in California because of some of the issues related to irrigation versus um, folks on wells having access to water. And now they've created this amazing data set. So now all these well records are available online. You can go in and see a map and click on a dot and see all that stuff. And so in their portal, you've got all of these different layers of things that you can look at. It's a lot, but it's worth the time. And the ArcGIS map service shows all the well completion reports. You can, if you go there, you can see when all this was updated and created. That's not as relevant for a homeowner, but if you're into the GIS thing, like many of our staff are, then those features matter, and having the metadata to go along with it. It tells you what all the different layers mean when you get into the viewer, how the data are collected, all that stuff. That can be very useful when you're trying to, especially identify a problem, a water quality problem. Um, yeah, and what level, like the location, how accurate it is, and things like that. I won't go through this a lot, other than just having all of this online, and what these layers mean and what the features are is important. So as a well owner in California, you go into the map viewer, and then if you click on a dot like I did, you see that who drilled the well, the driller's license number, he has to be licensed. This, you can see the little bar um, on the right near the word drilling. I mean, that's maybe 1/5 of the information that's on this record if you scrolled up or down. And so there's a lot there. If I click on that to get to that actual record, um, it gives you more information. And you can see again, this bar goes way across. There's a lot of columns here that give you information, location, all that stuff. This is New York's version. It's a little less sophisticated. And I use that partly because I spent some time in upstate New York working with a lot of well owners up there. I spent a week and a half. And what's interesting about New York is they didn't pass a law requiring logs to be filed until 2000. And so when this all happened, when I was there, they only had maybe 10 to 15% of the well logs on file for all the homes in New York that actually have a well, which is, pretty frustrating, and also just the way it is. I mean, that's the way their state legislature moved, and to get things done for this, and they went to great lengths as their DEC and their health department to improve that. They know now about, as far as the property, a tax parcel, they know where about 90% of the wells are. They may not have all the geology and some of the other information, but this is what they provide. And so what's interesting here is, yeah, the information they do have, how much the casing is. So for instance, there's a well right in the middle that shows a casing length of 19 feet, and that's because it's in bedrock, and the well's 80 feet deep. And so because the casing's only 19 feet deep, that well will take water from any fracture in the rock below that. And that can be a risk because a lot of those fractures in that rock are at the surface. And so any kind of surface efforts, contamination could get in that. But it's good to know, like many states now that have these sorts of things online, it's all transparent. You know who the owner is, you have the location. If you're buying a property, you can find it. The thing that's not necessarily as available as any water quality data for a given well. A lot of states do not have that information or have it online. Most of the testing has been done privately. There's no quote known um, program for just randomly testing private wells that I know of, other than a few states require testing at property transfer, like New Jersey. And so from that, they get about 13,000 samples a year. So about 13,000 properties change hands in New Jersey every year. And so from that, they're required to take a water sample, and there's some great data there. I'm probably getting ahead of myself. And you can also see the original log. And so, this isn't ideal, but at least it's some information for a well in New York. And so and these vary by driller too. Some are better at being diligent about providing this information, and others not so much. It's tough for a state to enforce, that every line is filled out or that every detail is there. There's just not enough manpower at most of our state agencies to do that kind of level of review and requirement. Another example is here at Illinois. We're at the Water Survey. The GeoSurvey is our sister agency, if you will. Poorly named, in my opinion, ILWATER, but it stands for Illinois Water Well Interactive Map. So it's the way it worked out. So anyway, you click on the interactive map, it brings you to a page where you can see, the colored area. I think that's more of a brownish or tan. I'm colorblind, so I'm not sure there, but that's an aquifer underneath this area. This is close to Champaign, where I live, and all the blue dots are water wells. The other colored dots are for other purposes, monitoring wells, bridge borings. Some of those things end up getting in here, especially monitoring wells that are used like through our state primacy agency for water quality and things like that. But if I zoom in, this is our airport near Champaign, and a well just outside of that. There's all the details that are on that specific record as far as what shows up when you first click on it. If I click on the blue API number, I get this, which is, it's a generated record. It's not the actual well log. The GeoSurvey put a lot of effort into understanding the geology, which is their mission. And so they put all of the layers or the geologic formations that have been passed through as the driller drilled the well in a database. And so you can see the geology, you can see some of the basics about, this is only a 3-inch cased well with a 6-foot screen at the bottom. It's because there's so much aquifer here. This fine sand and gravel is, it's even more thick when you move further west. It's as much as 150 feet thick. So there's a lot of water available. So even this small well, looks like, there was no drawdown really, pumping at 15 gallons a minute. And the little blue boxes at the bottom are where the Water Survey and GeoSurvey have we each kind of have separate roles for our pieces of this. We actually scan the original log, and so you can click on that blue box and see the actual log the driller filed. And this is again from 1959. And so this was a diligent driller who provided us this information voluntarily back in those days. And that's what this well looks like. Actually, he completed it in 1968. I'm guessing, I never thought about this before, but I'm guessing that when the law passed, drillers were asked to put these logs together and provide them to their county health department, because it was in 1968 when the law happened. So, anyway, this is a log. This is what it originally looked like. There's a lot more information here, and these have changed over the years as our Illinois Department of Public Health has added things, and now instead of 18 things, there's probably 22 or 23 on a newer log. But you can see there's a lot of information. There was a pit, 5-foot, 50-inch diameter pit. We don't, wells should not be in pits anymore. That was done because of the cold weather we have here and frost lines. So you put a well down in a pit to keep it from, so it was below the frost line and pipes didn't freeze. Nowadays we use pitless adapters. and those things aren't necessary. They're also a hazard when there's a heavy rainstorm and things like that. But more information about the pump. Yeah, this is a 169-foot well, all that sort of stuff. And so here's a little later well, and I show this one because this is a bedrock well. And going back here, you can see this should show. Yeah, so there's a screen. Going back to this one, yeah. So the water's from the sand. There's a 1 3/4 inch, 7-foot slotted screen, which is at the bottom. So it's the bottom 7 feet. So that's the message there. And if you go to a bedrock well, you can see from the geologic log on the bottom right, the hole that was drilled was 260 feet deep in the end. They hit shale, so they stopped because it won't provide any water, but the limestone does. And so this is a well that's finished in limestone. And you can see that number 15 above that shows that there's 179 feet of PVC and then 20 feet of black steel. So they hit bedrock at 189. And so they went 10 feet into the bedrock and seeded a steel casing, 5-inch steel casing. If you try to seat PVC directly in rock, you have to kind of tweak it. There's you put a thing on the bottom so that it'll seal properly. If you put too much torque on a PVC piece of pipe, you're going to break it. And so the bottom 20 feet is steel, so that they could torque that and make sure that it's sealed. And then they use PVC the rest of the way up because it's a lot cheaper. And I guarantee you that's why this was done without talking to anyone directly. But the deal is from 199 to 260, that is an open hole. And that means there's no casing. It's the hole that was drilled through the rock with the drill bit that created this 5-inch hole. And for every fracture it hits in the rock, those are places where water can come in the well. So if you didn't have an open hole and you had casing all the way down that was solid, then no water can get in the well, right? And so that's why that's done. But it's good to know that this only has casing to 199, where I mentioned before, like the example from New York, it only had 19 feet of casing. That's not as safe, honestly, as having 199 feet of casing, just because anything from the surface has to move through 199 feet vertically down, fractures or however, to get to where it could get in the well in this case. So, and there's a lot of other information here. Who is this for Camp Algonquin, which is west of Chicago. So yeah, there's a lot of information. Depends on the state, as I mentioned. So as far as I Googled Oklahoma aquifer maps. Are you in a major aquifer? Are you in a minor aquifer? Or are you in no aquifer? A lot of times you have a large diameter, which 2 or 3 foot or more diameter well. It's shallow. It's either bored or was hand dug. That's because there's no aquifer at your location, or they didn't know of one at the time. Like, for instance, I grew up, my grandpa hand dug a well on our farm in 1933. It's 14 feet deep. He had no idea that if he'd have just had somebody come and drill about 70 feet, he'd hit a sand and gravel aquifer that had been a lot better water. But you do see a lot of old hand dug wells or bored wells in areas where maybe clay at the surface and there just isn't a known aquifer there. But you can find all that information just by how you Google and search. And so this is Oklahoma's thing, if you will. So they've got a lot of maps that are PDFs. You can go in and look at those. This is just a state map. It's not that helpful for an individual location, but these are showing you where all the major and minor bedrock and alluvial aquifers are. And alluvial means usually it's a river. It's laid by a river. So along, if you go to a big river like the Mississippi, the bottom land around the Mississippi might be 15 miles wide, even though today the Mississippi might only be a half mile or a quarter mile wide in some places. At one point when the glaciers were melting, it was actually 15 miles wide. And all the sand that got displaced and deposited, all that is an alluvial aquifer. And so they're usually along rivers. They're water laid, if you will, and that's why some of these look so thin and long, because there's a river system running through there that put all that sand down. If you look at groundwater wells, again, they have this is their viewer. I circled the layers up there because you can see all these layers that I clicked on. You can go in and turn on and turn off different things if you want to look at certain things, like you don't want all the geology there. Maybe you've talked to a local geologist or your state geological survey, and they've said, the Wichita Granite is where, I'm just picking one of these, is where your well's located. Then you can turn some of those off. There's a lot of, this is really well done as far as tools. They even have, up here groundwater levels, so the wells where they're monitoring the water level to see what's going on. But if I zoom in here and say groundwater wells, then these are all the wells, and the different colors represent different things. Some are just reported, some are groundwater, some are monitoring, some are domestic. But you can see, and like this, the little thing that looks like, I think it's red, but they kind of look like plants that you'd see in the ocean. That is a small alluvial aquifer along a river. And so there's some sands there that are shallow, and those would provide water to a well. Another example, just I was looking at major bedrock aquifers, and so there's a lot of wells here. If you're in this area and you have a bedrock well, hopefully you'd be able to find that information. But you can also look then at the same location and see what else might be available. It's more shallow, and it's really just along that one set of river, that river system. Yeah. As far as, again, I was honestly just playing with their website, looking at all the information that might be available. There's really a lot here, especially if you have an interest in geology, as far as understanding where wells are located and what units they're in, how they're being used, all that stuff. And so if I add in monitoring wells, the first one was just reported well logs. The wrong direction here. This is just reported well logs. Then if I add in monitoring wells, so there's something going on. This is probably a municipal area, in a community or near a community. And so all of these monitoring wells are in place because of other regulations related to water quality. Not only landfills, but even certain gas stations are required to have them in some states, and a lot of other things. So, and then if I add groundwater wells here, I clicked on one that's 60 feet deep. It's in this shallow alluvial aquifer that's in Comanche County, and all that information is available. Versus this is a well that's in a bedrock aquifer, and it's a commercial well. It yields 75 gallons a minute. It's 1,200 feet deep. Much more expensive and larger well, I'm sure. So they also have, that's all the well logs. You can do a well record search. This is, again, varies by state. I'm using Oklahoma as an example. But if you know the county and the township and range, which should be a legal description that might be even on the deed to your property, or if you have the well log, or, well, I guess you're looking for the well log here. You can look and see what wells are available in that local area. You can use a plat to find it, or even probably ask Google, what township, range, and section is this address in Oklahoma. It'll probably tell you. But then you can just see the results. You can download them. If you're trying to, who the owner is or was at the time. And then, there's a lot of issues related to wells, mainly because you can't search by the owner. The person you're buying it from may be the third owner. And unless your state has things in place to make sure that gets transferred, which I don't know any that do, the well log is going to have the original owner on it. And so that's the thing you probably want to know if you're trying to find your well log, is who was the original owner when the well was drilled. So, and they have water level data. So not a lot of data here, but it's better than none. And this is just one well I picked out. It's a 34-foot well, so it's in the shallow alluvial sands. But A lot of states don't have any of this data available. Uh, we have this available in Illinois for our monitoring wells that we maintain, and we actually have telemetry on those so that we collect hourly data. But those are not uniformly spread throughout the state. Depends on what type of project they were built for and what the need was at the time when they were drilled. Which this is an example of one of our wells. This is north of Champaign-Urbana, about 10 miles. You could see that, and this is available on our website. So if you live near Rantoul or Gifford, you can follow this well and see what happens. Excuse me. Every summer. And these drawdowns in 19 and 20 in July are because there's irrigation wells that utilize the same aquifer. And so you're seeing not a lot of drawdown, but 10 foot or so in 2019. And in 2012, we had a drought. It was worse. You can see that we started monitoring with telemetry, where we collect hourly data with a pressure transducer in the beginning of 2019. Before that, those little diamonds are all hand measurements, where we have folks. Some of our staff are, there's a network, they go out and monitor those, and they still have to measure those just to make sure that the transducers are still accurate. They're still providing, useful data, all that sort of stuff. But it really gives you a window into what's going on and the dynamics of how the water levels change in a given aquifer. So they're really valuable information. If your state has them and there's one near you, it's pretty useful. And I'd say the group with the largest network of these wells nationally would be the USGS. We actually partner with them, and some of our wells are actually on their website as well, where they've added a shallow well or a deep well, or we already had a well, and we're monitoring multiple aquifers at once, because they can be very different in how their water levels change. So if you're asking, well, what about my state? It's really do Google first or search first, see what you can find. If you don't find really good information, then you should still find information about the agencies that house this sort of data, and you can reach out to them. And like I said, you need to be a little bit inquisitive and be willing to make those calls or send those emails. Groups like the one I work at here, we're more than willing to help a homeowner understand their well, their water quality, all those things, give them advice. Not only because we have this private well program, but before the private well program was funded, we did this as part of our jobs, and we still do. And so depending on the type of question, they may send you to an engineer or a geologist or someone who specializes in glacial geology, which is the sand and gravel, versus bedrock geology, all those sorts of things. Or the person that, for the given well, like the one near Rantoul, if you call me and ask me more information about that well, I know exactly who to send you to. One of two people would be able to give you a lot more information, because they're the ones who track that data, collect it, go out and take the measurements, and if they've done any water quality sampling of that well, they'd have it. So yeah, it is part of my job, and all of our staff do this regularly. In fact, we get calls through our help center, but we also get calls directly to the water survey from our general number that are about the exact same issues. And those are generally folks in Illinois, versus from our help center, they're all over the country. But it's just what we do. As far as what to test for, so again, every situation is different. You need to understand how deep your well is, where you're getting your water from, sand and gravel versus bedrock versus a dug or bored well. Are there any known contaminants in your area? You should always test for those. And you should ask your county or local. Not every state has county health departments. They have a local health district instead. Ask them for advice if they, especially locally, if they know there's anything. Again, I'll go back to Tazewell County. If you call the Tazewell County Health Department and ask if there's anything in particular you should test for besides general inorganics and metals, they would say, well, make sure you test for arsenic. We know we have a fair amount of it in our aquifers in this county. So again, talk to your neighbors, your driller, or a well contractor. They may have some ideas of things that have been found as well. In some cases, like a drilling contractor, maybe a family-owned business, and they've been around drilling since for 100 years, literally. And so they have a lot of good information. And most are willing to share. Every once in a while, you run, like in any industry or any other type of situation, you always sometimes run into someone who isn't as helpful. But that's not specific to anything related to wells. It's just the way the world is, unfortunately. So, but we do recommend sampling for coliform nitrate, which most groups do, not because of the water quality part of that, but if you have them in your well, it likely means that there's a pathway into your well, because you only see coliform nitrate typically at the surface. And so it's a cheap, simple way to understand if there might be a breach in your well cap isn't properly sealed, maybe there's not the grout that was supposed to be around the annulus of your well, which is the outside of the casing, didn't stay in place. So, I mean, if you have coliform nitrate issues, there's got to be a reason. It's either your well construction or something about how you're protecting your well with a sanitary well cap and things like that. There's also places online for water quality information. I'm just going to show a couple examples. Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, this is what they make available. They've done enough work looking at both arsenic and uranium in the state that they know exists in their bedrock wells, that they created this map, and this you can enter your address and it'll tell you whether you are at risk for having high nitrate or high arsenic or uranium. And then they've even got, you can see up in the upper right, there's other things you can click on, fact sheets, where their labs are, general guidance, all that sort of stuff. So it's handy. Rhode Island, this is the state of Rhode Island, and their health department, Small and Mighty, they have this on their webpage. It's actually really interesting. So a lot of these little circles that are for arsenic are because of orchards that, arsenic was used as as a pesticide in orchards to kill bugs until the early 60s. And so you have a lot of these old orchards that apparently there's a lot of them in Rhode Island that now have shallow groundwater contamination because of all the arsenic that was used over the years. And we use this kind of as our poster child for why you need to ask about local contaminants. They have a large area that has high beryllium in their aquifers in Rhode Island. I didn't even know beryllium was a regulated contaminant until I saw this map, actually an earlier version of this map, but it has health effects. It's regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Like Providence has to be sure that their beryllium is under a certain level by law, but private wells obviously don't have those requirements. But if you lived in this area, you'd need to worry about testing for beryllium, which, as a national technical assistance provider, if you will, we would not recommend that everyone in the country test for beryllium. That's why you need to ask what's going on locally, what should I be concerned about. You never know what you're going to find. I've been doing this for 38 years, and I was pretty surprised to learn about beryllium overall, just because I'd never ran across it before. Wisconsin has a really nice viewer. This is an older screenshot. It's a little better map today, but you can pick a county, pick a contaminant. I picked arsenic by county, and it tells you, for all the samples they have, what level they're finding. So, the standard for public water supplies under the Safe Drinking Water Act is less than 10 micrograms per liter, a ppb. And so you can see the areas in yellow and especially the ones in red near Green Bay. The average well water sample they have records for was over 21, the ones in red. And so if I'm moving to Green Bay in that area, it doesn't mean I'm not going to buy a home with a private well, but it means I'm going to make sure I test it before I buy a home with a private well. And that's our recommendation. For people, folks, you don't be scared of the fact that map shows that that's red. That doesn't mean every well is. It also means you just need to know what to do if you have a water sample that's high in arsenic. There is treatment available. There are options. this shouldn't be a distraction or discourage for everything else related to buying a home. Um, yeah. Anyway, it's just this is great information to have, uh, whether you live there now or whether you're thinking about moving to a given area. So what we recommend, and again, we're reaching a national audience. So we're not going to recommend beryllium. We recommend that you sample every year for coliform and nitrate, I previously mentioned, and then a set of inorganics and metals that are listed here. They give you a good, basically, understanding of the water quality of your well or your groundwater. And again, also get advice from your local or state health department. And if there's anything that they recommend um, as well, it's good to know. And like iron. Iron is not a health risk, but it certainly can stain things. It can clog your pipes. If it's oxidized, it forms iron dioxide, which is that red scale. It's good to know whether you have some of those things or not, because you don't want them, ruining your porcelain and you're staining your clothes and some of these things like that. As far as when to test, really anytime that you have to open the well or anytime something's happened. This is in El Paso County, Colorado. This is after a wildfire. They have a ton of these pictures of these homes where their well had an aluminum cap, um, and it was hot enough that it melted it. It's it laying on the ground, all disfigured because and the wires that go down to the pump, you can see that big glob that's just inside the well. It's because of all the housing for the wires all melted and stuck in one place. I'm sure some of that dripped down in the well. It's just unfortunate whenever there's kind of an emergency event like that. Um, Same way with a flood. If your well gets overtopped by water, then you can't assume your sanitary well cap. These well caps have a seal, a gasket, and especially in a cold environment like in Illinois, in northern Illinois, where it's you have freezing in the winter, those gaskets may start out the first year providing a perfect seal, but after 3 or 4 years of winters and summers, they get brittle, they crack. More wells than not that we've opened to either take a sample or water level measurement either has partial or no gasket left. And in those cases, then it's not really watertight at all. And there may be bugs that are getting in there. But if it's in a low-lying area and there's a flood event, um, it's likely that that some of that flood water got down in the well. And you should always not drink the water. We have a lot of resources available on that specific topic through our help center. As far as getting it analyzed, every state accredits labs for public water supplies. So every public water supply, every community in your state has to test every 3 months. They have to show that your water's safe to drink. They have to treat it if it's not. That's why there's drinking water treatment plants in almost every community. They're removing iron. If there's high iron, they're doing a lot of things to make your water safe and taste good and all that stuff. And so that testing, most communities don't have their own labs. They send it to a commercial lab. And so there's a list on every state primacy agency's website of those labs. And, the thing to do is to find out if in your state there's any programs for private well sampling. For instance, Iowa has the Grants to Counties program. It's not called that anymore. I keep forgetting that. But their state legislature provides resources to their county health departments to cost share things like abandoning wells and collecting water samples. So, but when you go to a lab, they should be able to give you good instructions, be able to explain any questions you have. If they can't, then we would recommend finding a different lab, in all honesty. And this bottom bullet here says, soon we're hoping to provide an option for well owners. There are no good, like in Illinois, our state health department used to have a lab that provided resources, and so did the state water survey. Neither of those provide sampling for homeowners on private wells. As a service. And so in Illinois, a resident is now has to rely on a commercial or a private lab. And so we're working to try to find the lowest cost option we can for folks in Illinois. There are a number of commercial labs they can go to. Some are more expensive than others, and we understand that for a lot of people, spending $300 on a water sample is a lot to do, and that would be the full list. Or just nitrate and coliform. Again, depending on where you send the sample and what state, and if there may be a neighboring state that has a lab that you can get a kit from, those sorts of things. You're still looking at probably at least $50 probably for that testing, and again, that's going to be variable. So if you can find a program, some states do have cost shares, or some of the counties in Illinois, for instance, during Groundwater Awareness Week, which is in March, second week of March usually, they may offer free sampling for coliform and nitrate during that week, and you should take advantage of those things if you can. As far as EPA certified labs, again, every state certifies labs because they have to, because of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is managed by the US EPA. And so when I search for certified labs on the EPA's webpage, you can find this certification of labs. It's called NELAC certification. You can click on a state, it'll give you that detail. I'm just going to show a couple examples. When I clicked on Alabama, it took me to this website where you can find information about their labs. Here, this is New York's, and they have a list. It's a searchable database of labs that are approved. The matrix means here whether it's chemical or biological or both, or something else. Maybe it's just radiological things, but you can search that way to find information. This is South Dakota's page, so it really just varies. And to find a lab, but there's certainly ways to do that. And so you can also, through our help center, if you call us or email us with those questions, that's one thing that we get frequently is, say, where should I get a sample done? And we usually give people either an online option and if it's nearby them, an actual physical lab that may be able to provide that analysis, and then they're on their own to find out what the cost difference is, if there is, ease of getting that done, all that sort of stuff. This also happens sometimes. I know this page has been updated. It's not this way today, but I left it here because, a US EPA web page that links to 50 state web pages. This is going to happen anytime a state decides to change their website or update things, change their URLs, go to a different management system for their website. And so there are other ways to find this if this happens. But typically, there'd at least be a phone number here where you can call and find out what happened to their webpage if that does happen. And see, and knowing where to look, it's just a different link that the EPA hadn't updated on their webpage. So that stuff, it's important. It's being used by public utilities all the time, and so it is. It's just been put in a different spot. We also mentioned online a minute ago, TapScore. It's called mytapscore.com. They're also basically a commercial lab. It's a unique program started by a PhD student out of Berkeley. What they've got contracts with about 200 labs around the country, and if you go to their webpage and shop for a water test, they send you a kit in the mail or UPS. I'm not sure which service, but it includes a label to send it back. It has instructions. You can do it all from your home. And because of the volume they do, it's probably it's something to consider rather than using a lab nearby if you look at costs, if that's important. Some folks are much more comfortable not doing something online. I don't blame you. But it's, they've been around for a while. They do really good work. They got a really great webpage that explains a lot about water chemistry and contaminants and issues. And so we partner with them every year during Groundwater Awareness Week. They give us 2 free tests, and we have a Pledge to Test campaign that Katie runs, where we ask well owners to sign up and pledge that they're going to test their well, whether they win or not, that they're pledging to test their water this year. And then we draw 2 of those folks out of a hat, if you will, and they get a free test. And it's about $200 for the test that's for the private well test that does all the basic stuff. And so it's an interesting concept, and they do send these to certified labs. They don't have their own lab; they're kind of a middleman. But by doing all the shipping and providing all the support afterward and doing all the other things, the labs that work with them only have to do the analysis. They don't have to have somebody who's a well expert, um, or that deals with all the shipping issues. And because it saves the lab money, they're able to transfer that cost, and because they're doing it in volume, it was a really great idea, I gotta say. Um, and so it's kind of streamlines the process for everyone, and allows them to offer it at a lower cost due to volume. As far as interpreting results, there are websites. There's actually one I'm probably going to show you here, um, but you should always take it to your local health department and ask for a qualified answer. And if they don't, if a local health department maybe doesn't have someone qualified to review those results, your state health department will. Um, yeah, it's important to have someone locally who understands the regional water quality and well issues in your state. Like I said, there's these websites you can use, and I am going to show you one of them, I'm pretty sure. Oh, I guess I'm not. Well, I'll mention that the state of New Hampshire, with funding from CDC, built an online tool that you can type in all the results for your water analysis, and it'll tell you if anything's over, a level for the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is what communities have to strive to be at. So if arsenic's over 10, it'll pop up with a red X and say, your arsenic level's over what's recommended. And so it's really handy in that respect. Um, it's not just for New Hampshire. There's a number of states that are actually using this tool now. And if you want information about that, we can certainly provide it. And I thought I had that slide in here, and I guess I don't. But in one of the other presentations we do on common questions, I know it's in there. I imagine for the sake of time, I didn't include that here. As far as funding and financing, there's a lot of costs related to being a private well owner. If you have to replace a pump or a well, or anything else, it may go bad or may fail. Pipes freeze, some of those things that can happen. You also need to be sure you're managing all the other things around your home, especially old abandoned wells or your septic system or anything that might be stored near a well. And so you need to understand all those things. And we do have another webinar that goes into a lot more detail, as well as our class lessons go into a lot more detail. And again, hopefully I'll keep referring to those, because the first place you should start is going through our 10-lesson class. And then once you've gone through that, you'll have a better understanding of where we're coming from and what we think is important and why it's important to you that you actually understand all those concepts and issues that are provided. Then you're going to be in a better spot to ask questions, find out who locally can help you, and all that sort of stuff. And then really the issue is well owners don't understand these responsibilities. And that happens with us so much, folks. Even today, some of the questions that were asked indicate that this is a homeowner that doesn't know a lot about how to take care of their well, and that's okay. None of us are really in the business of being a water treatment expert or being a purveyor of water like an operator for a drinking water system is in a public water supply. Sorry about that. So you're individually responsible for all of this yourself. USDA does have a program for providing funds through the Farm Bill, but the problem is that particular program has a very low threshold. It's 60% of the local poverty level. So unless your family income is below that, you're not eligible for that program, and that's really the only national program that's out there. But there are sometimes local programs, at least for testing. I know New Mexico has a program that they're trying to identify all their septic systems in the state. And if you provide that information to them, they'll give you a free water sample, for instance. Or through the RCAP program, these well assessments. If a person comes out and does a well assessment with you to identify and provide a lot of information about your specific well and your property. A lot of times they're also doing a water sample at no charge to the homeowner. But all those things are expensive. There just aren't a lot of resources available. We do a webinar just on funding and some of those resources. We haven't updated that. It's available on our YouTube channel because until the Farm Bill changes, which hopefully is actually going to happen, it hasn't changed since 2020, since 2019, I guess, or 2018. We expect the new Farm Bill to raise the limit on what income can be, also include things like not only just for well or septic repair or replacement, but also adding treatment, water sampling, and a more broader spectrum of things that would be beneficial to well owners. So, but until that happens, all the information that we have is basically still the same, unless there's like a local unit that's providing. I mentioned Tazewell County offers free testing during Groundwater Awareness Week, for instance. So again, this is the webinar that we have available. It was done in 2023. And Dolores and Andrea are both from USDA. They did the first part of the presentation about specifically their programs. And again, for low-income folks, it's really a great program. But for many well owners that would be above that 60%, they're not eligible. And so, but in that webinar, we also look at a lot of different options for local, or examples where there's local help for a homeowner with a well. As far as emergency situations, which is also part of it, FEMA, today FEMA is a different agency than it was. Even when we did this webinar last year, whether it depends on what's going on. I know we worked with the Texas Well Owner Network and folks in Florida when they had flooding, 8 or 10 years ago. They were able to get FEMA assistance for private wells. And so that's something that has to be done at your local or state level, depending on the emergency. One thing that has come out, like last year, there was a drought in Vermont and some wells went dry. There is no FEMA or federal support for drought assistance like there is for flooding or fires or hurricanes. And so it depends on what state you're in. And for instance, we mentioned the Texas Well Owner Network here because they have experience with that because of the hurricanes they have down there. And so they were able to secure funding to help a lot of homeowners get tested and ensure their wells were safe, or get them chlorinated or shock chlorinated and disinfected to be safe. And so you really just have to look. We found a few, and we're always on the lookout if you know of any other programs that are state or local for providing support when there's an emergency like this. We're always interested if you let us know. And so I want to talk a little bit about the private well class, and here at the bottom is really the gist. It's the answer to what can I do to help private well owners understand their wells and their water. Have them take the private well class, and if you're a well owner, just sign up for the class. When you go to our webpage, scroll down a little bit, it'll say take our free class. It's totally up to you. It's self-paced. You're on your own. It's 10 lessons. They're sent to you once a week over 10 weeks. It's been pretty well tested. So this is our front page. And so a lot of folks come to our website because they have a question. And so that's why that button at the top, Visit the Help Center, that Sally runs, is there. And then scrolling down the page, ready to learn more, it takes you to a link to sign up for our class. It's this page, Roll in Class. If you scroll down, there's a place to do that. Really, we ask for your name, your email address, and for location, it's just state. And really, this is here as much for showing the RCAP and US EPA that we're working. We have folks interested from all 50 states taking our class. And as far, as for our progress reports and things like that, it's really counting beans, but it's a necessary part of understanding for us how effective we're being. So we've had over 14,000 people take our class now around the country and in a number of other countries as well. In fact, we just held a private well conference, our sixth one, and we had folks, I'm not sure they all arrived, but we had folks from Canada and another country who were planning to come to that event. The class is also available in Spanish. So if you know of or work with in an area where there may be homeowners who are native Spanish speakers, they can go through the entire class in Spanish, which is really helpful, including, all the figures have been updated. Like this is a figure from the Minnesota Department of Health that's been, been edited basically into Spanish. We're fortunate being at basically a world-class research university that we have folks from all over the world who come here to school. We had a PhD student in civil engineering who was here on a Fulbright scholarship, so he had no teaching responsibilities, and he was very interested in providing a better set of materials for Spanish-speaking folks, and he did all this work. Maybe he did us a great service, all of us, by doing this for us. For every lesson, like the first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater, we also have these supplemental resources. And these are mostly things that were used to help develop that lesson, but also a lot more figures, examples of handbooks. It just depends on the lesson. But these are, if you want to go more in depth, then our lessons usually 6 to 10 pages long for each of the 10 lessons. And some of these, like the Well Owner Handbook from Minnesota, I know there's one for Texas as well. The second one there, those have a much more detail and 50 or 60 pages long. But if you really want to learn, they're here for you. It's probably the thing that most people tell us in the evaluation at the end that they've used already is these extra resources to learn more about a topic they may not have a great understanding of. We also do webinars every month, like the one we're doing today. This is if you click on free webinars, this is that page. If you scroll down that page, there's some that were kind of either one-off or haven't done that webinar for a while for whatever reason, like water testing and treatment. We worked with our lab and the public health lab folks, as well as the Water Quality Association, to do that example. And the Association of Public Health Labs represent all the state labs in the country, and the Water Quality Association has a certificate program for treatment dealers and represents all the companies that develop treatment equipment. So it was actually, it's kind of a unique webinar. It's probably worth your time. And so if you scroll down this page, there's a lot more available. Things that we've done that we've only done 1 or 2 times and don't plan to do again, or they're on specific topics like our on-site wastewater system assessment. They're all available on our webinar page. They're all on YouTube. Every webinar we do, we've done over 140 now webinars in our 13 or 14 years, and on a number of topics, like the one with the 2 young ladies there, Jackie McDonald Gibson and Jennifer Hopnick Redmond. They did a study funded by US EPA to look at PFAS around the country. And so they did a webinar for us it says 5 months ago, but this is a dated slide. It was last May. I think I mentioned that as one of the questions was about PFAS today. But it's really interesting what they found. They give recommendations on the ways to treat it, all that stuff. So pretty cool. And again, you can find that there. I mentioned before that some of these webinars we do quite frequently. That's because we have new people sign up for the private well class all the time. And so our focus also has to be on someone who just joined us for the first time today. And so some of these webinars we offer at least once, if not twice or more a year. And this particular webinar, I'll go back, is my water safe to drink? Common questions. We've offered a number of times, as you could see. And what I'll mention here is the slides up till now are very similar for these presentations. But when you get to the questions, which we're about to get to, they can be very different. It depends on who asks what questions. And, if someone's asked a really obscure question, it's probably not here. but if someone's asked a pretty common question that we think other people would be interested in, those are the things we answer, or things that maybe haven't been asked before, but they are worthwhile for more than just a one-off answer. And so if you go to the YouTube videos and go to the part where we get to the questions, you can spend an afternoon and learn a lot about a bunch of different topics related to um, questions that well owners have for their wells and their water quality. We also have these videos. There's just 20 here. I think we might have 21 now, but they're 3 or 4 minutes usually on a specific topic. What's a dug and bored well? What's a sand and gravel well? What's an artesian well? All those sorts of things. I guess I skipped that. We have one that is about how does my pressure tank work? It's had 400,000 views, I think, and it tells us that a lot of folks who have pressure tanks either can't find a lot of information online or just don't understand, the basics of a pressure tank are it's got a shut off and a kick on based on pressure. So when your pressure tank gets below, say 30 psi, the pump will kick on. When it gets to 60 psi, the pump kicks off based on that pressure sensor, and that's really how it works. And if it's not, you don't have enough water pressure, there's things you can do to change that and stuff like that. We have a podcast that goes out. We're on season 8, I believe. We do 12 episodes at a time. This is just a hodgepodge of several that are private well related. So like Brian Swistock, he was with Penn State, probably the most knowledgeable person I've ever met about private wells. He's retired, but certainly his legacy lives on, and they've done a lot to support the well owners in Pennsylvania, especially because it's a state that doesn't have a well construction code. And to be a licensed driller in Pennsylvania, you only have to pay a fee. There's no continuing education. There's no test to take. You and I can both be well owners or be licensed well drillers in Pennsylvania if we wanted to be, just by paying that fee. Hopefully that'll change someday, but Penn State and Penn State Extension have done a lot to work with the well owners in their state because of those issues. Alan Wolf is a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital. He deals with specific issues with children that a number of times have end up being private well water related. And I mentioned earlier, Virginia Tech has a great program. That's Aaron Lean's program down here in the bottom left. And they've been doing that work since, as long as I can remember. And so they have a ton of information about private well water quality and how to help well owners in Virginia. And this last one here, Water Quality Investigations is a company, engineering firm, if you will, or I guess more of a consulting firm that deals with biofilms. And we're learning more and more about how biofilms affect water quality in homes with private wells. Nearly every private well does not disinfect, which means they don't have a UV system or they don't have a continuous chlorination system like a public water supply would. And because of that, most homes on private wells will have biofilm develop in their plumbing. And it's an emerging thing. We're really trying to learn more about it ourselves, and they are the experts. And so we had them both talk at our conference in 25, and they've been on our podcast. Well, 2 other staff have been on our podcast. They're very helpful, and they do this every day, and it's quite a interesting topic. And then our hotline, or actually, I should have changed this title here. It's the Private Well Help Center. And this is still our old logo. Boy, I didn't change the slide. I apologize to Sally and Sarah. You saw it earlier on one of the other slides, but it's, have questions, visit our help center. So we have 2 folks who during work hours are answering questions. You can call them on the phone, you can email them. You can go to our knowledge base, which is a set of about over 150 articles, if you will. Getting ahead of myself. And so you can search yourself. So there's a number of articles. Every one of them is like the title of the article is a question. What should I sample for? And then the body of the article is that answer. And so you can search You can also ask this bot. It actually uses only the materials we provide it, and it's actually really good too um, for some things, mainly because we stuck all our lessons in there, all the text from our webinars in there, as well as all of these article answers. And so if you have a question, you can go there. If it doesn't satisfy you or you're not sure, you can contact us. Some people don't like to have interaction, which I think is a shame. You certainly get a lot better result when you talk to a real person. And I can't tell you, Sally can probably tell you how many times folks have said, "Oh, I'm so surprised I actually got a real person," whenever they called our number. And so it's a great service. We've had, literally hundreds of thousands of people come to the site annually now, either to find answers or to talk to our staff. So for instance, if I just put in flood, this is an example I've used for quite a while now. It shows all the articles that have flood in it. And so it's a number of different things you could, if you're just worried about is my well safe after a flood, then when you click on that, it takes you to this article, which is also one of our videos, the short 4-minute videos I mentioned. And down at the bottom, there's a link to that, or here there is. But also down at the bottom, there's other resources that we found that we think are relevant on flooding. So if this short article doesn't satisfy everything, there's more resources available for you. You can look at that are typically from a health department, from a state, or some other trusted source. And I guess in the end, I show this slide every time. This is our goal as the team that runs the private well class. We want well owners to really understand why their well is important. It's a big part of protecting their public health. You can't live without water, all that stuff. And why it's important to understand how it works, so that when you do have a problem, you have an idea of what's going on. You have an idea of what the solution might be. We see sometimes, as an example, well, that's kind of in the weeds, so I'll let that go. And how to protect themselves from risk. Do you need treatment? Well, you got to test first. Don't just add treatment randomly, and don't just drink bottled water because you haven't found out what's going on. It's super expensive in the long run compared to drinking the water that comes from your well and your groundwater. So it's really those things that we hope to get across to well owners. And we try to be consistent. We're going on 13 years, and we're always trying to be available to anyone who needs us. So as far as questions for today, we'll get through some of the questions, not all of them. I think in the end we had about 28 or 30 questions total. And so I'm going to go through the ones that we could answer today or we chose to. And then if you have additional questions, as I mentioned earlier, put them in the chat or the question box, whichever you have on your GoToWebinar screen. And we'll pull up a Google Doc that we share. Although I forgot to load that, Katie, it's going to take me a second. And we'll go through those. So, so for PFAS, the question was, what information is out there and where do you find information on PFAS for well owners? Well, some states have actually started sampling private wells. I know South Carolina has. Other states have sampled all their public water supply wells, like Illinois. And so they did this a few years ago, and now they put this online. But you can see where all the wells are that were sampled, and the ones that are colored have, they found something. And so that's a source of at least identifying that. That's probably the broadest testing in the state, and that's really the only testing that we would have access to per se. Most, like I said, in Illinois, a homeowner with a well, their really only choice is a commercial lab. And so when it's a private lab, they're not required to disclose that. Most well owners will keep that information to themselves, if you will. Every once in a while, someone will send us the results and ask us to help interpret it, which we're glad to do. But again, we always recommend you also talk to a health professional, Sally is a licensed environmental health professional. So that's that part of it. Sometimes we even recommend you should talk to your doctor. But going back to this topic, every state does this differently. They may have some data, they may not. Some may offer programs for private well owners to test for PFAS. I think Wisconsin does that now because there's been a number of areas where high PFAS have been identified. Um, New Jersey requires it as part of their property transfer law now. So they have a lot of PFAS data that they're gathering, but they don't share it for an individual property. They show it on a map with a 2-mile grid, and that's partly to protect property values. But it's important still to know and understand. And so you just got to look. And as far as for private well owners specifically, I mentioned it already. We had top Jennifer Hopnick Redmond and the bottom Jackie McDonald Gibson. They're both in North Carolina. One works at RTI International, which is a research institute in the Research Triangle I think in Durham. I'm not 100% sure. And Jackie's the head of civil engineering, civil and environmental engineering at North Carolina State. They had did this large study, and they looked at different kinds of areas in the country. Like they looked in Minnesota near a 3M plant. They looked in another area where biosolids were land applied. They looked near another area in the country where there was an airport where they had done fire testing and training, and as well as areas that shouldn't have any known exposure mechanisms to see what they find. And it came up basically what you'd think you'd find. In some of those areas they were kind of high, in some areas they were much lower. But they also talk about, Jennifer does, about treatment and the kinds of treatment for a private homeowner that you can use to remove PFAS if you find it in your well. And even though you know what treatment's available for it, you should still test and make sure you need it. The folks in Minnesota, which is probably one of the best health departments in the country, quite honestly, one of their folks actually suggested early on to me in this program, like over 10 years ago, that we don't even tell people about ways to treat and some of those things, because what he saw in practice working with homeowners is most of the time those treatment devices became a source of contamination, especially bacteria, because people weren't changing the filters or changing the cartridge or whatever and maintaining them the way they're supposed to be. And so natural groundwater will grow bacteria. It's just the way it is. And so you've got to maintain all that treatment equipment. Who owns the water? Well, it really depends. And can someone come in and deplete your water supply legally? It really depends on the laws in your state. Illinois is a law of reasonable use, so the water is considered publicly owned, and anyone can use the water on their property if it's for beneficial use. And if there's an impact to another homeowner or from another source, unfortunately, your options are to go to court to prove there was damage. And I had this happen to me. I had a homeowner call me. He had a well. He was on a bluff above a river bottom, and a quarry a sand and gravel quarry was between him and the river. But they were nearly a mile away, and then they bought some farmland, and they moved to within half a mile away and started dredging and dewatering that sand and gravel, and his well went dry. So being in Illinois and being part of my job, I told him that I'd write a letter of support. We need to come out and take a look if he chose to do that. And I recommended that instead of hiring a lawyer, the first thing to do would be to go to this company and let them know what happened and ask if they would either deepen or provide him a new well, because your only other choice would be to take them to court. And that, I even told him the water survey would write a letter of support saying that this is what caused it, based on their past use and how long that well had been in place. And where it was finished is in the same sand and gravel that this was being pulled out of. They're just at a higher elevation. And I'll be honest, I actually had almost zero confidence that that would work and that he was going to have to go to court. But it's really, to me, it's so frustrating that a homeowner has to hire a lawyer and pay whatever that might take to try to maintain their water supply. But in the end, the quarry chose to drill him a well. That's why I tell that story, because it had a great ending. But that's in Illinois. Other states have different rules. The rule of capture, it means you have absolute right. Whether you affect somebody else or not, you can pump whatever you want. It's correlated, they're called correlated rights. It's a shared resource. That's kind of what we have in Illinois. And the other is really called prior appropriation. And most of the Western states were this way. Some have kind of changed those laws a little bit. It's kind of a hybrid approach, like California, I mentioned. But in most states, if there's not an exemption for a domestic well, because in theory they pump so little, some states do have exemptions for domestic wells. You have to have a permit, and your rights are dependent on how long you've had them. If you were first there, it's actually called first in right, based on how long you've had that water right, and you're allowed to pump a certain amount based on what your permit says. And junior rights holders, it's a kind of a pecking order. And the thing that's really, not a great system for that is in a drought year where there may be a limited amount of water available. The senior rights holders get their water first before the junior rights holders can actually get theirs. And I'm not a huge expert on water law other than what I've just said. And so the National Ag Law Center has a lot more information available if you really want to know. But you should find out if you just Google water law in my state, and I would say groundwater use law in my state, it'll probably tell you. There'll be some information available. And I think it's through the Water Systems Council. They have a gentleman who is also a lawyer that contracts with them. I think he's at Virginia Tech, who's created a document that provides state-specific information on a lot of things, and I think it includes that. But you'd have to look on the Water System Council's website to see if that's there, because it's been 10 years since I've seen that document. I don't know if it's been updated or where that stands. What's the minimum distance in linear feet of a private well to a private septic system to guard against nitrogen contamination of the water source? Okay, so most states have well construction code. And this is an example on the right of Minnesota's and the setback distances for different things. So if you'll notice in Minnesota, for a typical system, septic or holding tank has to be 50 feet from a well. That doesn't always hold. In a lot of cases, the state will have a setback. I think in Illinois, it's 75 feet. But they also then have a variance system or a vulnerable aquifer definition that goes along with that, where if it's an area where it's likely the water can move freely, like it's mostly sand and gravel, even near the surface, then that setback distance may be doubled or it may be further away. The reason I say it's not just that simple, it really depends on a lot of factors. Where's your well finished? If you have I'm going to use Champaign County where I live as an example. If you have a well in the Mahomet Aquifer, it's a sand and gravel aquifer, it's protected by nearly 100 feet of glacial till, which is mostly silt and clay. It gets hardly any recharge from the surface because water can't get through all that. And if you have a well that's properly constructed and grouted, which is the seal you put around the outside of the casing where the borehole was, and your water's coming from a well screen that's down at 200 feet, then it doesn't matter how close your septic field is. In all honesty, it's not going to get into the aquifer and affect your well. It may get into a shallower unit. So every state comes up with a set of rules, like Minnesota's here, that say this is what we expect to be a safe distance. It's not set in stone. It depends on the geology, depends on where you're getting your water from. An old dug well, like I grew up on, if the septic system was very close to the well, it'd be a problem. Or if you're in a county that's mostly sand and gravel, even at the surface, in Illinois, that'd be Mason County, which, the entire county is irrigated because the soil is so sandy, there's no water holding capacity. It's along the Illinois River. It's in a big river bottom. There, everything that you do at the surface matters because it infiltrates directly into the aquifer. And again, the last thing would be well construction. Is it properly constructed? Is it, the casing has integrity so that nothing's, there's no joints that are where the welds have failed if it's steel, or where the PVC may have come apart or broken or has a crack in it. All those things matter. And so you can't just say, uh, and lastly, it could be the flow direction. If you have the example I used to always use, just understanding what your risks might be. Let's say that I'm in a rural subdivision that has a cul-de-sac at the end. So there's 2 rows of houses going up to a circle drive, and that's 80 feet above some lake that's down near the entrance. Every home has a well, every home has a septic. So the person at the very top, their natural flow of their shallow or water table groundwater, which is where the soil becomes completely saturated, is going to be towards the lake. Flows downhill. Water flows downhill. And so if I'm the house at the top of the hill, my septic is flowing down towards everybody else's. If I'm the person near the bottom of the hill, and I have everyone above me, their septic is migrating through the soil. Bacteria are breaking it down, but at the same time, it still could be moving. If there's any preferential flow or other things that could affect it. So understanding your well matters a lot. And so if you have a bored well, for instance, a 3-foot diameter well that's got 3.5-foot concrete tile or a 3-foot concrete tile, it's getting water at every one of those 4-foot seams, and anything that happens near the surface is probably more of a risk. So it's there's rules that everyone has to follow, and then there's common sense about understanding what your risk might be. I use the same argument for people who are in this new subdivision that's on the edge of town and their backyard backs up to a farm field. What about pesticides and nitrate? Well, it goes back to your well construction, where you're getting your water from, is it from, and what the geology is nearby. It's all sand, very sandy soil, then more is going to infiltrate than if it's all clay soil. Is bedrock at the surface? That's even more of a risk, in my opinion, because flow through a fracture is like pipe flow. There's no resistance to flow, and there's no, at least in sand and gravel can act as a natural filter and give bacteria time to break some things down, or to change nitrate in part of the nitrogen cycle. But that's not going to happen with fracture flow. So you have to know your local situation. That's the bottom line. Setbacks are a guide, and they're a requirement because you have to have some rule. But there's times where they don't stand up, or times where they don't matter as much, and that's just the common sense part of all that. Do I want to know? So this great question, because we see this sometimes, and I'll give an example in a minute. This isn't a question, but a comment of transparency. Part of me wants to learn all of this, test my water, etc. But another part of me is afraid of opening a huge can of worms and has fear of major headaches. That's a very valid and real thing that we hear from homeowners all the time. In fact, when we used to get funding to do studies to sample private wells, one of the questions was always, well, why should I say yes? Are you going to help me if I need treatment? It's going to cost a lot of money to someone. It's like why you don't go to the dentist or the doctor when you should. Man, my tooth hurts, but thinking it's going to go away isn't going to happen, right? Eventually it gets worse. And in this case, worse would be that you drank it for 25 years and now all of a sudden you have a health condition. So the thing is, there's plenty of private wells that bring water into your home that's perfectly safe as it is. It very well could be your situation. But if you don't know, again, you can find out the hard way. You can have a sick child or grandchild, or even worse news. I could give you an example of that. It's really disheartening. So again, would you never change your oil, or would you never go to the doctor and just not take your kids to the doctor because you don't want to find out there might be something? And you're going to take care of it because you're trying to protect your health, and the car costs a lot of money. And I'll just say, knowledge is empowering. Being controlled feels better than living in fear. Or some people will just buy bottled water and pay all that extra expense because they have no idea if their water's safe or not, and they don't want to test to find out. So I told Sally. Sally was like, I should be positive about this. I want to tell this example because it's affected me since the day it happened, to be honest. I had a homeowner in Southern Illinois. I was contacted by a county health department. They had some questions about this home. I met them there, and this gentleman, he was 74 years old. He'd lived there for 40 years or so. It was an old dug well. It was in a low spot in their yard. Their garden was right next to it. They were 20 feet from a farm field, and there was a state highway maybe 60 or 80 feet from all of this. He found out he has terminal cancer, and he only had a month to live. He wanted to know if it was worthwhile for him to test his well for pesticides. And so the facts here are it could have been something from 20 years ago, right? I mean, I'm not a health professional, but it isn't necessarily something that he would be drinking today that caused it. So even if he found something in his well, could he prove that that's what caused his cancer? There's no way. And so as we're talking to these folks about what they should do and what they, my comment or my suggestion was, it really doesn't make sense to spend $700 testing for pesticides. It's not going to give you. He's just looking for answers. I would be too, probably. I don't know how I'd feel if I found out I had a month to live. But then as we're talking, there's a state highway, and his wife mentions, well, so I'm probably going to sell my home, and there's a water line between our two communities. There's a rural water district here, and would it be worthwhile for me to hook up to that instead of using this well? And because I'm going to sell my property, I'm going to move to town where my daughter is. And I didn't even know what to say. They had a chance 15 years ago to hook up to a public water supply, and they didn't want to do it, which I would recommend to anyone, almost in every case, because then someone else is responsible in making sure your water's safe. And sure, you have a water bill, but if you maintain your well properly and test every year, you also have expenses, so you need to give yourself a water bill. And in the end, the solution there is they have an old hand dug well that's only 22 feet deep. They know it causes problems, that it gets muddy water when it rains, all those things that are bad. And if she's going to sell this property, if she spent $6,000 hooking up to the city water supply, it would probably make her house worth $20,000 or $30,000 more, just because people know they have a safe water supply, and it's in an area where it's just outside of a bedroom community for a large city. But it just makes you sick to your stomach to think that they just assumed everything was okay. They've never tested. It was gut wrenching to be there that day, to be honest. And it's better to know than to regret it years later, is the bottom line. And I also tell people, when if you live on a well and you've lived there forever, and say you've got grandkids and they come every Thanksgiving, 4 of your grandkids got sick, some kind of, everyone assumed it was, I always say Aunt May's potato salad, just as an example, but it very well could have been your well water that made everyone sick. You don't get sick because you're used to drinking the water. They get sick because they're used to drinking chlorinated water from a public water supply, and they come here and they drink your water, and it's got bacteria in it. So it's better to know and to protect your family. And no matter, can't preach that enough. And that's, as I said, that was a pretty tough day, really, for me. Yeah, because then they just didn't know. They needed to take care of that well. They assumed it was always safe. It's always been that way. And that's the way my dad was. He believed, and my dad had heart issues. It had nothing to do with our well water, I don't think. But our well was always contaminated. But he swore it was better than city water because cities put chemicals in their water. It's not better unless you've tested it and you know it is. Okay. Is this webinar going to cover locating local well information in Florida as an example? So we did do that. And as far as if your state doesn't have things, I think I already mentioned there's someone who can help you. And I already said there's 2 people in Florida I rely on. Yiling and Andrea have been on our podcast, and they're in Florida. They work both wells and septic. They know all the players in the state. And I also added in here, we usually have several health department folks from Florida on these webinars. Oh, I didn't put us in there. So if someone from Florida, from a local or county or the state health department are on today, if you want to put anything in the comments or in the question box about resources that are available, I do know that Florida has one of the few state data sets on septic systems in the state. Most states don't do that at a state level. Florida does, but I honestly don't know and didn't look up before this call about their well records. And so I would send you to these two folks. If you called me directly, I would, or emailed me, I would forward your email to Andrea and Lee. But there is support because I know, like I said, I know when Katie does the CEU credit stuff, there's always a number of folks from Florida who their health department and for their continuing education credit as licensed health professionals, they participate in our webinars for that thing. So you can always ask Katie or Sally or Sarah through our help center if you can't find things, but I'm encouraging you to try to find things. Don't just call us so that we can look it up for you. If it's there, you should be able to find it. And you need to, you need to take control of your well and your water system and your health. And that's one way to do it. Yeah. Best season to sample a vacant home's well water that has been unoccupied with a septic system that hasn't been used. Okay, so there are a couple things here. I do want to mention that if you go to our help center and where I typed in flood at the top, if you type in seasonal, I just typed in season, this article comes up. And there's a lot more to this. I just clipped the portion that I could fit on here, but this goes down much further. A lot of good information on what a seasonal system is. There's a lot of those where people have a summer home or a someplace they go, a vacation home or whatever it might be. You have responsibilities for that type of property if you want to protect your water supply and your septic. And I'm not the septic expert here. Really, Sally's the person to answer that question. But whenever a septic tank doesn't have anything coming into it for months and months and months at a time, it may stop functioning just because bacteria need food to grow. Excuse me. And it's the bacteria that are breaking down all the stuff that comes from your home. And so it might need to be pumped, and you're basically starting over. So it takes time for all the bacteria in our systems to get into that tank and grow. But it's not ideal for a septic either. But as far as for a well, if you have a property like this, you need to take care of it. And part of that is number 2 there, drain the system before you leave. If you let water sit there for 6 months in your pipes, there's no perfect system. It's likely not going to have pressure when you get back. And if there's air in those pipes too, then you have a lot of bacteria growth every year. And you need to chlorinate it then and cause all kinds of problems. But one of the first things to do when you come back is just to test the water. And it's really not about, there's not a best time. It's whenever you are going to use it. So that's the message there. Is there a good place to sample the water at a resident's house? Well, so we suggest that, and honestly, I'll say up front, no one does this because it costs twice as much money. But to make a long story shorter, until 2008, the State Water Survey Lab tested any homeowner in Illinois' well for free. And so as a groundwater scientist, we asked them to collect 2 samples. One from their inside tap, which is the water they're drinking, preferably the kitchen tap, and then one from an outside spigot where it's either, even a hydrant near the pump or the well, where it's not going through any treatment, it's not going through anything in the home, the pipes in the home, if it's available. And we actually told people to let that, collect your house sample first as your kitchen tap, and then let your hydrant run for 15 or 20 minutes, and then take a sample, because then we knew we were getting a sample that was actually groundwater that was just coming into well. Within 5 or 10 minutes, usually a pump will kick on. So it's clean. So you're taking a volume of the well water out. So it's not even the water that's sitting stagnant in your well. It's fresh groundwater coming into your well. And that gave us a lot of information. And they're very different, mainly because of treatment or what might be in your pipes. So an outside tap is representative of natural well water. a natural groundwater, and then a kitchen tap would be representative of what you're drinking. Both are important to understand. But again, we can't ask people to pay for that. And so that's basically stopped since 2008. We have no new, quote, groundwater data that comes from these samples, which now our lab doesn't even do that testing. And I'll show you an example. So this is a private well near Champaign where this first sample is from an outside spigot. And the things I'll point out quickly are that, on the iron was high, 2.99, sodium's fairly low. The turbidity and color on the right side are fairly, there's a lot there, if you will. And the hardness is 351. Okay, so then they took a sample after they have an iron filter, or a 5-micron filter, it's not an iron filter, and a softener. Well, now the water's been softened. They're using sodium salt softening. Now look at the sodium level. It went from 25 to 98. And certainly the hardness on the bottom right went from 350 to 0.68. That's great. And a lot of things are much less. It's done its job or whatever. The thing I'll note, I forgot to mention, is on the first one, the pH was 8.06, I think. On this one, it's 8.1. So the pH is really high. That's great. If you have lead pipes, for instance, low pH or a lot of alkalinity can affect leaching of lead or cadmium from galvanized pipes and stuff like that. And so the fact that the pH is high is great. Then they added an RO system under their sink. And so RO takes out many things. You can see all these less than symbols, but it also lowered the pH. It took out all the buffering. And so if what I use an example here is if someone has a whole house RO unit, which isn't necessary, I don't know, I can't think of a reason to have a whole house RO. If someone tries to sell you that, tell them no, or talk to me. But now the pH is 6.23. So you've lowered the pH, it's below, neutral. It could affect if you have galvanized pipes or lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder. You may be causing some leaching now. And so all of those things matter. And what you care about is what you're drinking. And I get that. And that is the most important thing. But this is really interesting if you're really trying to understand your well water. And some people can afford to do that, some can't. We certainly, if it weren't on your dime, this is what I would recommend. So, last question. I know it's almost time. I believe the well in my home was established between the 30s and 40s. There's no information in the state database. How do I research this? Well, then this is someone in Pennsylvania, and as I've mentioned several times, like the well I grew up on, there's no record in our files, and they were asked. Records weren't even required until '68. And so unless a driller chose to do so, I think your only hope, honestly, is if you can find a driller or a drilling company that's been around forever and ask them who might have drilled the well, or if it was them that would have been in the 30s or 40s. And if so, they may actually have that information. But because you're in PA, Pennsylvania, it could be more of a problem. We're actually dealing with someone who had a well drilled last year, and because the state has no authority to force well logs to be filed, the driller's refusing to give this person their well log. And that's a whole nother story, and it's only for Pennsylvania. But it's really frustrating to think that a driller would drill somebody's well and then do that. And so, yeah, we need to get back to that homeowner and help them with their situation. So in most cases, you need to find the original driller. Like we had a driller here who was retiring and wasn't handing off his company to anyone in his family, or wasn't able to sell it or didn't want to. And he just said, "Hey, I have all these well records. What do you want me to do with them?" I said, "Bring them in." Well, we may not get to them right away, but he gave us boxes and boxes of records that would have just been thrown away. And so a diligent driller, a lot of drilling companies have gone away because it's a family business. A lot of times the children don't want to take it over. And so there's fewer drillers today than there were 20 years ago, for sure. And so it may not be in business, the company that put in the well, but maybe so, or maybe they were diligent enough to hand off their records to another driller in the area. We've certainly seen that happen. But that's really probably your only hope. Otherwise, you can camera the well, or you can have a contractor come out and verify the depth and some of those things to get some information. But as far as the geology, you're better off looking for a record of a well that's nearby. The geology is probably going to be similar. Anything we didn't get to, or that if you have other questions, don't forget we do have a help center. It is very helpful. Yeah, there's a lot of things you can find there. And then, Katie, I need to pull up the questions, so I have to find your email real quick from this morning. And I apologize for not having that up. So it looks like we have 2 questions. Okay, that makes things simpler. One question. Okay, do you have a URL for the Mexico well test if alert them to septic? So, okay, so it looks like Katie already answered this. And so here's the URL. I'll leave that up. I imagine if you Googled it, that's probably what Katie did. And yeah, it's a good program. I wasn't even 100% sure it's still in effect, but it looks like it is. So, well, thank you for everyone who's stuck around. And trying to find my GoToWebinar window buried behind all these other things. Okay. And if you have any further questions, you can email us. You can expect to get information about your CEs if you signed up when you registered. And so, yeah, you don't need to email us. Honestly, if you email us anyway, it clutters our inbox. It takes us more time. That's why we started doing this in the first place. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.